A cold afternoon wrapped around a man who had already lost too much, yet that day carried something waiting just for him. What seemed ordinary at first shifted into an encounter powerful enough to stir memories buried for years. The story that followed is not about coincidence, but about love and sacrifice stronger than time itself. Share where you are watching from, leave your thoughts in the comments, and remember to like and subscribe for more stories like this. John Miller had grown used to being invisible. Even though he once wore the uniform with pride, carried out missions under fire, and survived nights when others did not, his return home had left him to wrestle with silence. As a black veteran, he felt the sting of a double burden, fighting for a country that often refused to see him, and then fighting the ghosts inside his own mind. Each day, he carried the weight of memories that no one wanted to hear about. Not his neighbors, not the strangers who passed him by, and certainly not the world that moved on while he was still stuck in yesterday's battles. That afternoon was colder than most, the kind of day where the air seemed sharp enough to cut through the skin. John sat on his usual park bench, shoulders hunched beneath his coat, staring blankly at the frozen pond ahead. The laughter of children playing in the distance felt like echoes from another life, one that no longer belonged to him. He closed his eyes, and in that moment he was back in the desert sand, whipping his face, the crack of a gunfire ringing in his ears. Then something warm and heavy pressed against his legs. Startled, John looked down and saw an old German shepherd, its fur ragged patches of gray around its muzzle and eyes that looked as tired as his own. The dog did not hesitate, did not sniff or wait for approval. It simply climbed onto his lap with a weary determination curling against him, as if this was the place it had been searching for all along. John froze. Strays never behaved like this. They darted cautious and afraid, scavenging scraps, but avoiding touch. Yet here was this battered dog pressing its head firmly against his chest, eyes closed as though it had finally found safety. John felt a lump rise in his throat. His hands hovered uncertainly before finally resting on the dog's back. The fur was coarse and dirty, but beneath it he felt something unusual. His fingers brushed against a strip of torn fabric and cold metal. Carefully, he pulled back the tangled hair to reveal a fragment of what looked like a military harness, frayed and broken, but unmistakably real. His breath caught in his chest. His pulse quickened. He ran his thumb along the stitching. It was the same pattern he remembered from years ago, the kind designed for combat dogs trained to run into danger alongside men like him. A flood of emotions surged through him, disbelief, curiosity, and a deep ache that pulled at scars both visible and hidden. Around them, life in the park continued as though nothing extraordinary was happening. A jogger passed by, earbuds in. A mother pushed a stroller, glancing briefly at the scene with a smile that said how sweet before moving on. They saw only a man giving warmth to a stray. But for John, the moment cracked open something inside him that had been locked away for years. He stared into the dog's eyes again. They were clouded with age, but beyond the haze was a spark. He recognized all too well the same look he had once seen in the eyes of his canine partner Hunter, who had died shielding John from an explosion overseas. The memory hit him like a punch to the chest. He remembered the smoke, the chaos, the deafening silence afterward. He remembered holding Hunter in his arms, promising through tears that his sacrifice would never be forgotten. Yet here was another shepherd pressing against him with the same loyalty, the same unspoken bond, the same determination to be by his side. Tears welled up, blurring his vision. He hadn't cried in years, not since that day. His comrades had told him he needed to man up, to push through, to bury the pain. But now, with his dog trembling softly against his chest, John found himself breaking in ways he had long avoided. He whispered, barely audible, "Why you, why me, why now?" The dog gave no answer, only a deep sigh, as though releasing years of weariness into his arms. John held the shepherd tighter, his chest rising and falling in unsteady rhythm. He did not know what this encounter meant. Was it chance fate? Some cruel trick of memory? Yet in that instant, he felt something stir inside him that had been dead for far too long, the faint spark of hope. He thought of how he had wandered through this park for months without purpose, and now out of nowhere, this dog had chosen him, not someone else, him. The soldier who felt forgotten, the man who carried both the honor of his service and the weight of being overlooked in his own community. John sat frozen on the park bench, his arms still cradling the weight of the shepherd that had pressed itself into his lap, his mind swirling with confusion and recognition he could not explain. The chill of the afternoon had faded into nothingness compared to the cold wave rising inside him as he stared at the dog's eyes. They were not the eyes of a stranger. Though clouded by age, those eyes carried a depth he knew all too well, a gaze that reached through him and dragged up memories of the one companion who had never left his side in war until death tore them apart. Hunter. The name alone was enough to tighten his chest. He had buried Hunter in the dust of Afghanistan after the explosion, after the chaos, and the blood after the dog had thrown himself between John and the blast. He had whispered a promise into the fading breaths of his partner, a vow never to forget, never to let the sacrifice fade into the same shadows that consumed so many fallen soldiers. Yet here, years later, another shepherd stared at him with the same unwavering loyalty, the same steady focus, as though the past had found its way back into his life through fur and bone. His hands trembled as he stroked the dog's neck, whispering a name he had not spoken in years. Hunter. The shepherd's ears twitched, not in recognition of the word perhaps, but in acknowledgement of the trembling in his voice, as if responding to the grief that clung to the sound. Then without warning, the dog rose slightly, turning its body sideways, shifting its paws into a crouched position, so practiced and deliberate that John's heart skipped. He had seen this stance countless times before, during raids, during ambushes, during those nights when Hunter's training was the only barrier between survival and death. It was the protective stance, the one where the dog planted itself like a shield ready to take the hit before its handler ever would. John inhaled sharply, his mind caught between disbelief and painful recognition. He felt the echo of battle all around him, the shouts of men, the crack of rifles, the whistle of shells in the air, and here was this battered shepherd, crouched on the frozen ground beside him, as though they were back on the field together. His eyes burned moisture, threatening to spill as the weight of memory and present collided. He wanted to dismiss it, to say it was coincidence, the natural instincts of a dog bred and trained long ago. But deep down, he knew this was not a random alignment of behavior. It was a reflection, a mirror cast from the past into his broken present, forcing him to see what he had lost and what had been returned in another form. John's body shook, his breaths uneven as he leaned forward, his hands clutching the edges of the bench. The shepherd remained still, watching him with patience, its chest rising and falling in calm rhythm, as if waiting for him to accept what his heart already understood. The world around them blurred, the laughter of children muffled the sound of life at the park, fading into a muted hum. For a long stretch of time, it was only John and the shepherd locked in a silent exchange of recognition that defied words. He whispered again, voice breaking, "You shouldn't be here. None of this makes sense." And yet he could not push the dog away. Instead, he reached out and cupped its muzzle in his hand, staring into the misty eyes that reflected back his own grief. It felt as though Hunter's spirit lived on in those eyes, carried forward into this wounded, weary body that had chosen him out of everyone in the world. He thought of the explosion again, of Hunter's last act of devotion, of the guilt that had haunted him since. He had survived when so many others had not. He had carried that burden in silence, wondering why he had been spared, why his partner had not. And now, with this shepherd's eyes piercing through the walls he had built, John felt a flicker of something he had not allowed himself in years. Maybe forgiveness, maybe grace. He could not name it yet, but he felt it stirring. The shepherd broke the moment by shifting again, standing tall this time, pressing against his leg with quiet insistence. John understood. John's steps along the park pathway were slow and heavy, his mind still lingering on the weight of memory that the shepherd had pulled back into the light. Each sound of the dog's paws against the frosted ground echoed like distant gunfire in his head, yet it also anchored him, reminding him he was here, not back in the dust of war. The animal kept close to his side, brushing his leg, as if guarding him, not straying more than an inch even when laughter and chatter from families swelled around them. John's chest ached, torn between disbelief and reluctant hope. Then a young boy, no older than 10, suddenly pointed from across the playground. "Mister," he called out, his voice cracking with excitement, "that dog only listens if you use German. My dad told me he saw it the other day. It wouldn't sit for him until he tried English and German together." The words struck John with a force he did not expect. He froze mid-step, his eyes narrowing as the fragments of a puzzle began to press together in his mind. He turned to the shepherd, who stared back at him with those clouded but alert eyes. "You've been trained, haven't you?" he murmured, his voice trembling. The boy's laughter carried across the park, but John heard nothing else except the racing of his own heart. He bent slightly, placed his hand firmly on the shepherd's back, and whispered the first command that came to him. "Sits." The dog lowered its hindquarters, instantly, spine straight, gaze forward, a posture sharp and disciplined. John's breath hitched. He hadn't spoken that command since the days with Hunter, when every order was a lifeline. His pulse hammered in his ears as he tested again, louder this time. "Stay." The shepherd froze, not a muscle twitching, eyes locked on John with a focus that could have cut steel. Around them, people noticed whispers rising as strangers realized the old battered stray was moving like a soldier. But John's world had shrunk to only the two of them. He stepped back, voice firmer now, his tone slipping unconsciously into the cadence of command he thought he had left behind. "Come." Without hesitation, the dog leapt forward, landing squarely in front of him, tail low, but wagging stance proud, as though waiting for its next mission. Tears pricked John's eyes, and he bit the inside of his cheek to steady himself. He remembered training sessions, dusty fields, where handlers barked commands in German, so enemy fighters could not predict orders, remembered the way Hunter had obeyed with flawless discipline. This dog had the same muscle memory, the same ingrained obedience, the same absolute devotion. He swallowed hard, realizing this meant the shepherd was not merely a stray, but a war dog, a comrade cast aside by time and circumstance just like him. "Who are you?" John whispered again, though the question was more to himself than to the dog. The shepherd tilted its head slightly, ears twitching as if it wanted to answer. A woman nearby shook her head in awe, muttering, "That's not a regular dog. That's a soldier's dog." The words cut deep, reverberating through John's chest. He straightened eyes, fixed on the shepherd, seeing not just an animal, but a mirror of himself, trained for battle, scarred by survival, lost in a world that had forgotten their kind. The shepherd pressed closer, its body leaning against John's leg, as if sealing the unspoken truth between them. They were both relics of war, both adrift, and both in desperate need of each other. John clenched his fists, emotion storming within him. This was no coincidence. First the eyes that mirrored Hunter's, then the stance that mimicked battlefield readiness, and now commands in German and English, obeyed without flaw. The dog was showing him, piece by piece, that their meeting was not random, that there was a story beneath the scars. He wiped at his face, quickly embarrassed by the tears, though no one nearby seemed to judge him. Instead, the bystanders were quiet, reverent, almost as though they too felt the significance of what had just been revealed. John crouched to eye level with the shepherd, his hands cradling the dog's face. "You've been through it, haven't you? Just like me, left behind, carrying everything no one else wants to see." His voice cracked heavy with grief and recognition. The shepherd leaned into his touch, pressing its forehead against his eyes, closing in silent agreement. For John, that was answer enough. He exhaled long and trembling and whispered, "You're no ordinary stray. You're a survivor, and maybe, just maybe, you came back to remind me what it means to keep going." The shepherd wagged its tail once slowly, deliberately, as if affirming his words. John walked the shepherd out of the park, his mind consumed by the realization that this was no ordinary animal, but a creature forged in the same fire that had shaped him. He had felt the discipline in every movement, seen the battlefield etched into the dog's stance, and now he needed to know more. The dog limped slightly, its old joints stiff from years of hardship. Yet it pressed forward with silent determination, as though leading him somewhere unseen. John made a choice in that moment, a choice born from instinct and duty. He could not let this dog wander into obscurity. He would take it to the local veterinary clinic, a small corner office near the edge of town that had treated strays and farm animals for decades. The bell above the door jingled softly as John entered the shepherd close to his leg, head low but calm. The receptionist glanced up, eyes widening at the sight of the battered dog. "He looks like he's been through hell," she murmured, but John only nodded, unable to explain the truth he felt rising inside him. Soon they were ushered into an exam room where the vet, an older woman named Dr. Sanders, approached with cautious kindness. "Let's take a look at you, old boy," she said softly, her hands steady as she brushed through the tangled fur. John watched every movement, his nerves taut, as though waiting for a verdict. Then Dr. Sanders frowned, fingers pausing over something hard buried in the shepherd's coat near the shoulder. "Well now, what's this?" she muttered, pulling gently until she freed a small, rusted piece of metal from the fur. It was a tag worn and corroded, but faint numbers were still visible, K9311. John's stomach dropped, his pulse hammering in his chest. His eyes locked on the numbers, a code that stirred memories deep within his mind. Can I use your computer?" he asked, his voice urgent. Dr. Sanders hesitated, but nodded, sliding a laptop toward him. John's fingers shook as he typed into a database he hadn't opened in years, a registry of military service animals he still remembered how to access. When the results appeared, his heart skipped, and for a moment he forgot to breathe. The record showed K9311, codename, Shadow status missing in action Afghanistan 9 years ago. John's vision blurred, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. He stared at the screen at the words that confirmed what his heart already knew. This was not coincidence. This shepherd was Shadow, a war dog, once part of the same brotherhood that had defined John's life, listed lost to time and chaos, but now standing alive though scarred right before him. He whispered the name aloud, testing it like a prayer. Shadow. The dog's ears flicked head, tilting slightly, as if the name had pulled on some thread of memory buried within. John felt his chest tighten as Shadow's cloudy eyes met his own recognition, flickering like a dim but steady flame. Dr. Sanders placed a hand gently on John's shoulder. "He's been through something terrible, hasn't he?" John nodded, swallowing hard. "He was in the war, just like me." The truth settled on him like a weight, both crushing and liberating. He thought of the years Shadow must have spent alone, wandering, carrying the ghosts of battles no one remembered anymore. How many nights had the dog curled up in silence, waiting for a command that never came, guarding shadows of men long gone? John clenched his fists, guilt and sorrow twisting in his chest. He had thought he carried his pain alone, but here was proof that another had borne the same burden in silence for nearly a decade. Shadow leaned against him, pressing his body into John's leg, as though sensing the storm within him. John knelt, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck, whispering through tears, "You're not lost anymore. You found me, and I swear I won't let you go again." The promise echoed in the small room, carrying more weight than any vow he had spoken since the day he left the battlefield. Shadow closed his eyes, breathing steady and slow, as though relieved at last. Dr. Sanders cleared her throat softly, her voice low with awe. "Mr. Miller, dogs like him, they don't survive alone for this long unless they're clinging to something powerful, maybe loyalty, maybe memory." John nodded, his face buried in Shadow's fur. He knew exactly what had kept the dog alive, the same force that had carried him through years of isolation, the unbreakable bond of a soldier's heart. He stood again, his decision firm. Shadow was not just a stray to be patched up and sent away. He was family brother survivor. John carried Shadow home that evening with the weight of revelation still heavy in his chest, the dog's presence both grounding and haunting as he tried to absorb what he had learned. He had walked into the veterinary clinic with a stray and walked out with a living fragment of his own past a survivor whose scars mirrored his own. The tag with K9311 engraved sat on the table by his front door, now a relic of a time he could never escape, but also proof that fate had intervened. He had promised Shadow he would never abandon him again, yet he wondered if he was strong enough to keep that promise. His home was small, cluttered with reminders of battles he could not let go of, the walls closing in with silence every night. Tonight was no different, except Shadow's paws followed him into every room, the dog refusing to leave his side. For a while, John found comfort in the soft sound of Shadow's breathing, the weight of him lying close as John lowered himself into his worn recliner. But then the sharp cracks of fireworks burst outside, neighbors celebrating something John could not care about, each explosion shattering the fragile calm he had built. Shadow bolted instantly, tail tucked, scrambling beneath the table with a whimper that shook John's bones. His own heart raced as the noise ripped through his mind, dragging him back across time and space to a battlefield where each explosion meant death. The room spun and John dropped to the floor, hands clutching his head, gasping as visions of smoke and sand consumed him. His body shook, sweat pouring from his temples as he fought against the ghostly weight of memory. But then he felt it warmth against his chest, a heavy body pressing into him. Shadow crawled from beneath the table, ignoring his own terror, and laid across John, pinning him to the ground with gentle force. The dog's steady heartbeat thumped against his ribs, its breathing slow, rhythmic, insistent. John clung to the animal's fur like a lifeline, his sobs muffled against the shepherd's neck. The explosions outside faded into the background, replaced by the grounding presence of a creature who understood fear, but chose loyalty over it. Slowly, painfully, John's trembling eased his breathing, aligning with Shadow's. He whispered hoarsely into the fur beneath his cheek. "You came back to me. You came back." Shadow didn't move, only pressed closer, offering his body as a shield, not from bullets, but from memories. Hours later, when the night had finally quieted and exhaustion dragged John into uneasy sleep, Shadow remained curled against him, a sentinel in the dark. The next morning dawned gray, the air heavy with drizzle. As John stepped outside to retrieve his mail, Shadow padded at his side, walking stiffly, but determined, ears flicking at every sound. Across the narrow yard, raised voices pierced the air, two neighbors locked in a heated argument. John paused, the tension crawling across his skin, but before he could react, the scene escalated. The taller man shoved his own teenage son aside in anger, his voice booming with words that cut sharper than any blade. Shadow reacted instantly, breaking from John's side with surprising speed for his age. He planted himself between the father and the boy, body lowered, head forward, growling not with aggression, but with warning, his stance protective and unyielding. The boy's eyes widened, tears streaking his cheeks as he clung to the shepherd's flank. The father froze, his anger faltering at the sight of the old dog, standing like a wall of living muscle, refusing to move. John stepped forward quickly, his voice firm but calm. "He's protecting him. Back off!" The man blinked, shame flooding his face, and lowered his voice before retreating into the house. Silence fell across the yard, broken only by the boy's quiet sobs as he knelt beside Shadow, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. Shadow stood still, tail low but steady, his gaze locked on the closed door as though waiting to be sure the threat was gone. John's chest tightened as he watched memories colliding once more with the present. He had seen this stance before, not against fathers and sons, but against armed enemies. Shadow's body acting as a living shield for those who could not protect themselves, even after years of neglect and abandonment. The instincts were still there, the training still embedded deep in the dog's soul. He was still a soldier, still a protector, still carrying out missions, even when no one was there to command him. John knelt beside them, placing a hand on Shadow's back, his voice low with reverence. "You never stopped fighting, did you? Not then, not now." The boy looked at John with wide eyes, whispering, "He saved me." John nodded, blinking back tears. "He saved me too." When they finally returned inside, Shadow followed John without hesitation, settling at his feet as though the episode had been nothing extraordinary. But to John, it had been everything. It had proven that Shadow's loyalty had never faltered, that his purpose had never faded, that even after a decade lost to time, he remained what he was always meant to be, a guardian. That night, as John sat with the dog lying beside him, the weight of silence felt less crushing. The memories were still there. The ghosts still lingered, but for the first time, he did not feel alone in carrying them. He reached down, fingers stroking the worn fur, whispering, "You protected me when I was breaking, and you protected that boy too. You're still out there on the battlefield, aren't you, Shadow?" John could not ignore the shift inside him after the night of fireworks and the morning confrontation with the neighbors. The way Shadow had pressed against him when his mind had collapsed into battlefield memories, the way the dog had stood like a sentinel between a furious father and a terrified child, all of it confirmed that this shepherd was not just a survivor, but a protector whose spirit had never broken. The truth of the tag still weighed in his pocket, K9311, etched forever into his mind, and he needed answers more than just fragments of recognition or instinct. He decided to take Shadow on a walk toward the outskirts of town, where an old military base had been decommissioned years ago, but still stood as a ghostly reminder of the war that had shaped him. The path was quiet, lined with tall fences and rusting gates, and as John walked, Shadow kept pace by his side, alert, scanning the surroundings with the same vigilance he had shown since they met. Every step felt like retracing old ground, the kind of walk that pulled memories from beneath the skin. As they approached the perimeter, John noticed an older man standing near the chain-link fence, his posture rigid, despite the years, his cap pulled low, but his bearing unmistakable military through and through. The man's eyes lifted, and when they fell on Shadow, they widened with a shock that made him stumble back a step. His lips parted, and in a trembling voice he whispered, "That's Shadow. My God, that's Shadow." John froze, his breath caught in his throat. "You know him?" The man nodded, eyes never leaving the shepherd. "I would know that dog anywhere. He saved my squad in Afghanistan. We thought he died. We all thought he never made it back." He stepped closer, voice breaking. "We saw him run into crossfire to drag a wounded soldier out, and then he vanished in the chaos. No one ever saw him again." John's chest tightened as the officer's words painted the image clearly in his mind, the courage, the selflessness, the last act of devotion that had marked Shadow as more than just a dog. He looked down at the battered shepherd standing calmly by his side, tail low, but wagging faintly, eyes clouded but steady, and he felt tears rising. Shadow had carried that memory alone for 9 long years, wandering without recognition, while men who owed him their lives believed he had perished. The retired officer shook his head, wiping at his face. "We put his name on a wall. We honored him as fallen. But he lived. He lived all this time." His voice cracked with disbelief, and he looked at John, eyes shining with both sorrow and gratitude. "You found him, or maybe he found you." John swallowed hard, emotions twisting in his chest. "He found me," he admitted, his voice low. "In the park. Climbed right into my lap like he'd been searching for me." The officer reached down with trembling hands, touching Shadow's fur, his eyes glistening as memories flooded back. "You carried us through hell," he whispered to the dog, And now you're still carrying someone. Shadow pressed his head into the man's hand briefly, acknowledging the bond before returning to John's side, as if affirming where his loyalty now rested. John felt pride and grief collide inside him, his heart swelling at the realization of Shadow's legacy. This was no stray dog. This was a soldier, a hero, a comrade who had been written off by history, but who had endured against all odds. And now he stood alive, not just in John's life, but in the eyes of someone who remembered someone who could confirm what John already knew, that Shadow was extraordinary. The officer straightened slowly, his shoulders heavy with the weight of memory. Take care of him. He deserves more than the world ever gave him. John nodded firmly, his voice steady now. I will, I swear it. As they turned to leave, Shadow pressed against John's legs, steady as a rock, guiding him away from the ruins of the past into the uncertain promise of tomorrow. The meeting had carved something deeper into John's soul, a confirmation that Shadow's presence was not random, not chance, but destiny woven across years of pain and survival. John could not rest after the encounter at the abandoned base with the retired officer who recognized Shadow. His mind replaying the man's trembling voice, his tearful insistence that the old German Shepherd had once saved an entire squad in Afghanistan before vanishing into the chaos of war. The confirmation had settled heavily on John's shoulders, both a vindication of what his heart had already believed, and a haunting reminder of the countless ghosts they both carried. That night, as Shadow lay curled by his chair, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, John stared at the rusted tag on the table, K9311, engraved faintly into the corroded metal. He could not stop thinking about the man's words. We thought he died, but Shadow had not died. He had survived just like John, and survival always came with stories buried in silence. John knew he needed to uncover them, not just for his own peace, but for Shadow's dignity. He spent hours combing through online archives and making calls to contacts he had not spoken to in years. Men who had served men who had access to records civilians could not easily touch. Days passed and John barely slept, each hour consumed by his search. Finally, through a friend still tied to the Pentagon, he received a package of declassified reports. His hands shook as he tore the envelope open, the paper spilling across his table like forgotten relics of war. There it was, K9311, codename Shadow. The documents told the story in cold, bureaucratic language, but the weight of it struck John like a blow. Shadow's original handler had been a young soldier named Corporal David Reyes, killed in action during a brutal firefight nearly a decade ago. The file noted that Shadow had been last seen refusing to leave Reyes' side, barking furiously at medics who tried to pull him away until the chaos of enemy fire forced them to retreat. From that day forward, Shadow was listed as missing in action, but buried in the appendices were witness accounts notes from soldiers who swore they had seen a lone German Shepherd wandering near bases and outposts, always lingering near the grave sites of fallen comrades, sometimes spotted even at memorial walls erected overseas. The reports were inconsistent, fragmented, dismissed by many as impossible, but John knew better. He pictured Shadow wandering among the dead nose pressed to the ground, searching for a master who would never return. The thought broke him. His chest ached as he looked at the old dog sleeping peacefully on his rug, and he whispered through tears, "You never stopped looking, did you?" He reached down and brushed his fingers along Shadow's flank where a jagged scar marred the fur. The mark was old-healed long ago, but its location stopped John cold. It was on the same leg wounded in the ambush where John himself had nearly died. He remembered that day vividly, the explosion, the sandstorm of debris, the blur of bodies falling. He remembered thinking he would not make it out alive until someone or something had pulled enemy fire away, buying him precious seconds to crawl to cover. He had always believed it was Hunter, his own K9 partner, who had saved him that day. But now, staring at Shadow's scar, John felt his heart seize with a realization that both shattered and healed him at once. Shadow had been there. Shadow had fought in the same chaos, carrying the same wounds, surviving the same hell. Maybe it had not been Hunter alone who had shielded him, but also this dog, this survivor, who had slipped through the cracks of memory and history, only to return to him now. His breath came ragged as tears slid down his face. He knelt beside Shadow, cradling the dog's head in his hands, whispering, "All this time, we were there together. You've been with me longer than I ever knew." Shadow's stirred eyes opening slowly, gazing at John with that same unwavering loyalty that had first unraveled his heart. John felt the years collapse between them, the pain of loss merging with the miracle of reunion. For so long he had carried the guilt of surviving, when so many others had not. But now he saw the truth. Shadow had survived too, carrying his own grief, his own losses, his own scars. John awoke the morning after reading the declassified files with a heaviness that pressed against his chest, but also with a strange clarity he had not felt in years. The truth of Shadow's past had broken him open, revealing a story of loyalty and loss that mirrored his own. But instead of leaving him crushed beneath grief, it had begun to carve space for healing. He sat at the small kitchen table, sipping bitter coffee, his eyes fixed on the old German Shepherd lying across the rug, head resting on its paws, scarred body, rising and falling with steady breaths. The memories of Corporal Reyes, the years Shadow had spent wandering near graves, the scar linking him to John's own survival, all of it replayed in John's mind like a film he could not turn off. But alongside the pain came a fragile gratitude. Shadow had not only survived, he had returned. That meant something. That meant everything. When John stepped outside with Shadow, the air felt different, lighter somehow, though the sky was still gray and the streets were still worn. They walked together to the park, the same park where fate had first placed them in each other's path. Children played along the swings, their voices carrying into the morning air. John tensed instinctively, crowds, always making him uneasy. But Shadow pressed close body, brushing his leg like a silent reassurance. As they crossed the path, a small boy in a wheelchair caught sight of the shepherd. The boy's eyes lit up, and he reached forward with both hands, calling softly, "Doggy." His mother looked startled, pushing the chair back slightly. But before she could say more, Shadow trotted towards the boy with a gentleness that belied his size and age. John's heart leapt, fear quickening his steps, but what he saw next stopped him in his tracks. Shadow lowered himself slowly until his belly touched the ground, crawling the final inches to the boy's chair. The dog lifted his head just enough to rest his muzzle on the boy's lap, eyes soft tail wagging faintly. The boy giggled a sound so pure it cut through John like sunlight breaking storm clouds. The child's small hand trembled as it reached forward, brushing against the coarse fur, and Shadow remained perfectly still, his patience infinite. The boy laughed again, louder this time, and John felt his chest loosen. For the first time in years, laughter rose in his own throat, raw and unfamiliar, but real. He chuckled softly, then louder, until he found himself smiling fully, watching Shadow offer a moment of light to a child who needed it. The boy's mother had tears in her eyes, whispering, "He hasn't laughed like that in so long." John nodded, unable to speak, overwhelmed by the sight of Shadow reminding him and everyone present that life still had warmth even after years of cold. For a brief moment, John forgot the scars, the nightmares, the ghosts. For a brief moment, he felt human again. Later that day, as they returned home along a quiet street, the world reminded him how fragile peace could be. A car came hurtling around the corner, tires screeching, engine roaring. John had stepped off the curb, lost in thought, when the vehicle swerved dangerously close. He froze, the memories of explosions and gunfire returning in a flash, his body paralyzed in that split second between life and death. But Shadow moved. With the same unyielding instinct he had shown on battlefields, the shepherd lunged forward, slamming into John's side with his full weight, knocking him to the ground as the car roared past. The vehicle clipped Shadow's hindquarters, sending him sprawling with a yelp that tore through John's soul. Time slowed, every sound muffled, except for the pounding of John's heart and the ragged whimper from the dog, who had once again placed himself in the line of fire. John scrambled to his knees, hands trembling as he reached for Shadow. "No, no, no, not again," he cried, voice breaking as tears blurred his vision. Shadow tried to rise, his body shaking, but his eyes locked on John's with the same steady loyalty that had never faltered. The scarred leg buckled, but the tail gave a single thump against the pavement, as if to say, "I would do it again." John pressed his hands against the shepherd's body, checking for blood, praying through gasps. The injury was not as devastating as it could have been, bruises a limp, but no mortal wound. Relief washed over him so strongly, he almost collapsed against the dog's side. "You saved me again," he whispered, voice hoarse with disbelief and gratitude. "You've been saving me all along." He wrapped his arms around Shadow's neck, his tears soaking into the fur, his body shaking with the weight of everything this dog had given him. Shadow pressed his head into John's chest, breathing shallow but calm, as though reassuring him that the mission was still complete. Passers-by rushed to help, voices buzzing with shock and sympathy, but John barely heard them. He could hear only the echo of his own heartbeat and the silent vow forming inside him, a vow stronger than any oath he had ever taken in uniform. He would protect Shadow, care for him, honor every sacrifice this dog had made, because their lives were now bound together by threads no blade could sever. That night, as John sat with Shadow resting beside him, the dog's head heavy against his thigh, he thought about the laughter in the park and the terror of the street. In one day, Shadow had reminded him of joy and nearly broken him with fear. The incident with the speeding car had left John shaken, his heart raw from the sight of Shadow throwing himself into danger once again, but it also ignited something he could not hold inside any longer. He told the story. At first, it was just to a neighbor, then to the local paper, when a reporter heard whispers about the veteran with the old war dog. Before long, John found himself sitting in his small living room with journalists scribbling in notepads, cameras flashing, and microphones capturing his trembling voice as he explained how the shepherd had found him, how the rusted tag had confirmed his identity as K9311, and how the dog had saved him not only on the battlefield, but now in the quiet streets of their town. Shadow lay at his feet during the interviews, calm tail thumping gently whenever John's voice wavered. The story spread faster than John expected, moving beyond the town, reaching veterans groups, animal rescue organizations, and even military officials who had once recorded Shadow as missing in action. The calls began flooding in. Old soldiers who remembered the name left messages through tears recalling how Shadow had pulled them from burning vehicles, distracted enemies to give them cover, or simply sat with them in moments of despair. Donations poured in from strangers across the country, enough to cover every medical bill Shadow would ever need. John read every message that arrived, his chest heavy with emotion. They called Shadow an unsung veteran, a decorated war dog whose story had been swallowed by time until fate had brought him back. John looked at Shadow each night, whispering softly, "They finally know who you are." But more importantly, he thought they finally know who we both are. For years he had felt invisible, discarded by a society eager to thank soldiers in words, but slow to understand the cost they carried. Now, through Shadow, people were seeing the truth. Shadow had become a bridge between silence and acknowledgement, between pain and compassion. Soon the invitations came, requests for John and Shadow to visit schools, veteran centers, and community gatherings. John hesitated at first, uncertain if he could stand in front of crowds, his nerves raw, but Shadow seemed to thrive when surrounded by people moving gently between them, eyes patient, body steady. John agreed to a school visit, his palms sweating as he walked into the auditorium filled with children, teachers, and parents. The buzz of voices quieted when they saw the large shepherd by his side, scars visible, but dignity radiating from every line of his body. John told them the story, his voice breaking more than once, but the children listened intently, their wide eyes reflecting awe and sorrow. When he finished, Shadow did what Shadow always did. He chose someone to comfort. This time, it was a small boy sitting in the front row. His body tense, his lips pressed tight, his eyes downcast. The teachers whispered that he had not spoken in years, his voice lost to trauma no one fully understood. Shadow walked directly to him, lowering his head until his muzzle rested gently on the boy's lap. The boy froze at first. Then his small hands rose shakily, fingers brushing against the coarse fur. His eyes widened, his lips trembled, and then clear and soft but strong enough to reach every corner of the room, he whispered, "Friend." The silence was absolute. The teachers gasped, some covering their mouths, as tears streamed down their faces. The boy's mother sitting nearby began to sob openly, her shoulders shaking as she repeated, "He spoke, he spoke." For a moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted into applause and tears, the sound blending joy and sorrow into something sacred. John stood frozen, tears running freely down his face as he watched Shadow transform lives in ways even he had not imagined. The dog lifted his head slightly, tail wagging once, and returned calmly to John's side, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But John knew, everyone knew. Shadow had given a voice back to a child who had lost it, just as he had given John back the strength to feel alive again. That night, John sat with Shadow curled against his feet, reading messages from parents, veterans, and strangers who had heard the story of the mute boy and his first word. They called Shadow a miracle, an angel in fur, a reminder that love and loyalty could pierce even the darkest silence. John looked down at the shepherd, his voice low and steady. "You've healed me, you've healed him, and you've healed this whole town. You're not just a soldier, Shadow. You're a savior." The dog stirred, pressing his head against John's leg, eyes closing in peaceful acknowledgement. The weeks after the school visit were filled with a flood of recognition messages and support. John had never been the type to seek the spotlight, but Shadow had pulled both of them into it with gentle insistence, not through fame or show, but through simple acts of loyalty and healing that people could not ignore. For the first time since he had returned from war, John felt pride without the weight of guilt crushing it. He felt purpose, direction, and a strange comfort in knowing that his broken life was now tethered to something unshakable. But as the seasons turned, so too did time remind him that even heroes could not escape the limits of flesh. Shadow began to slow. The strong gait that had once carried him through war and danger became stiff, his breaths more labored with each passing day. John noticed it quietly at first, the way the old shepherd lingered a little longer on the rug before rising, the way his eyes grew heavy faster, but he refused to let fear settle. He gave Shadow every comfort he could, every soft blanket, every gentle touch, every whispered word of love. Yet he knew. The body that had survived bullets' fire, abandonment, and time was beginning to surrender. One night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, John sat on the floor beside Shadow, stroking his fur. He spoke softly, voice thick with emotion, recounting every memory of their short but powerful time together, the day in the park, when Shadow had climbed into his lap, the fireworks when the dog had calmed his trembling body, the school visit where a child had spoken his first word, the street where Shadow had saved his life again. Shadow's cloudy eyes met his, and John swore he saw understanding in them, a silent acknowledgement of the life they had shared. As the hours passed, Shadow's breathing grew shallow, his chest rising and falling with effort. John held him close, tears sliding down his face as he whispered, "You don't have to fight anymore. You've done enough. You've given enough. Rest, soldier." Then with a final surge of strength, Shadow lifted his paw and placed it firmly against John's chest, pressing there with a weight far greater than its size, as if declaring his mission complete, as if saying he could leave only because John was finally whole again. John broke sobs, racking his body as the dog's last breath slipped into silence. But even in his grief, he felt something he had never felt before: peace. Shadow's mission was over, but his legacy had only begun. In the weeks that followed, John refused to let the story end with loss. He reached out to the same veterans groups and organizations that had rallied around Shadow, and with their support, he launched an initiative called Shadow's Promise. Its mission was clear: to rescue and care for retired military dogs to ensure that no other loyal soldier would wander abandoned, forgotten, or alone. At first it was small, just John and a handful of volunteers, but soon it grew. Donations poured in, shelters reached out, soldiers came forward with stories of their own canine partners. Within a year, Shadow's Promise had saved dozens of dogs from neglect, giving them homes, dignity, and love in their final years. Each time John placed a rescued dog in the arms of a new family, he felt Shadow's presence at his side, tail wagging, approving. His name became a symbol of devotion, not just to those who had known him, but to countless others who saw in him a reminder that loyalty and love were stronger than war, stronger than pain, stronger than time itself. John would visit schools and tell Shadow's story, his voice steady now, not broken. He would stand at veteran memorials and remind the world that sacrifice came not only from men, but also from the animals who fought beside them. And every time he whispered Shadow's name, his heart swelled with gratitude instead of only grief. The town, the country, even strangers across the world who had once cried at a boy's first word, now carried a piece of Shadow with them. The shepherd's paw print was no longer just pressed on John's chest. It was pressed on every heart that believed love could heal, that loyalty could outlast death, that no hero should ever be forgotten. On quiet evenings, John would still sit by the window, looking out at the park where it had all begun. Sometimes he swore he could feel Shadow's weight against his leg, the warmth of fur, the steady breath of a companion who had found him when he needed it most. The end. Before we close, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did Shadow's journey touch you the way it touched me? Which moment of his story struck your heart the most? Tell me in the comments and let me know where in the world you're watching from. And if this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Your support helps keep these stories alive and shared with others who need them.